this next part, we're going to apply all that we've learned so far and begin working on a series of projects. Each one is designed to help you practice the process of using a different watercolor style and applying the techniques you've learned earlier in the class. We will also explore the process of using a reference image for our work instead of just practicing techniques. We'll begin with a simple landscape as I introduce you to the process and evolution of creating a painting. My students always say, knowing how to begin is the hardest part. By having a plan, we will find beginning much easier. While we are using many of the same techniques over and over again, each subject that we decide to paint requires a fresh look to discern the order and process of creating the effects we are looking to achieve. So let's start by taking a look at our reference photo. So this photo is a basic field with a sky, a midground where the trees are, and then a foreground where the grass is in front. The background in a painting is usually like your wall or your sky or something like that. The midground is usually the middle of the painting or the horizon line, and the foreground is what's closest to you. It's really important to understand those different parts. There are a couple general principles that we follow in watercolor. Because the medium is transparent, we'll almost always move from lighter values to darker values. Once we put something dark down, we can't make it lighter. So it's a really good practice to start from light and then add to, keep moving toward dark. We'll also start with bigger shapes. So we put the big shapes in first, and then later in the process, we fill in with the small details. We're going to apply those now to our landscape. I'm looking at my reference image here, and if I were going to start painting this, I would want to decide where to begin. Really, my hues are all about the same value. So my sky and my field, they're about the same. So I don't really need to think too much about light to dark, but I certainly want to think about foreground and middle ground and background, and I want to think about the big shapes. So I'm looking at the sky. I'm going to start there because that is my background. I'll start with my blue sky. I'll let that dry. And then I'm going to add in a tree line and build the big shapes of my foreground. We're not going to put in little blades of grass right away, but we're going to start with those big shapes that I see of like the yellow stripe and then a brighter green down the middle and then a more olive green on the side. So that's how we're going to approach this one. We also need to talk about our palette. Remember that we want to keep things harmonious. So the fewer colors we use, the better our painting's going to look. For this painting, if you look at the sky, on the left-hand side, you've got a more warm blue, like an ultramarine blue. But as it moves down toward the horizon, it gets a little cooler. So we'll be using both blues and maybe a mix of the two as well. For the field, we're going to use the same blues that we've used in our sky, and then we're going to add some warm yellow and cool yellow to build up these different colors. And then for the horizon line, where we've got that just really subtle line of trees, we're going to be adding some warm red so we can kind of mute the blue out to make ourselves kind of that brown color. So now that we have our plan and we've chosen our palette, I'd like to talk to you about the other supplies I need and how I've created my drawing. So I'm using a cold pressed watercolor paper. It's in a block, so I don't need to stretch it. It is a very simple landscape. So what I've done is I've kind of outlined the area that I want to paint in. I'm not going to tape it. I'm just going to try to stay within those lines a little bit. If you go out of the lines, it's okay because chances are you're going to mat it and frame it. I've drawn a horizon line. That's approximate, how I see it. And then I've drawn a very light outline of the cloud shapes. Okay, so it's just really rough. It's not exactly like my reference photo. I'm not aiming to make this picture exactly the same, and you shouldn't either. And ours aren't even going to look the same. So everybody sees things differently. We want to make it our own. So don't worry too much about that. In the foreground, I've basically just drawn some rough lines showing the direction of form that I see in my reference image. If you look at the reference image, you can kind of see how there are some shapes. And here, like where you see the yellow ending, I've kind of drawn a shape here, a line here. And then the direction the grass moves. I'm going to use those lines to guide me so I know what direction to take my paintbrush in. So it gives the field a little bit of movement and depth. We're going to start with our sky. I'm going to use a round brush. And I'm going to mix up some French ultramarine and some phthalo blue. So I've got some warm blue ready. And I'm going to have some cool blue ready off to the side and pretty watered down. It's not, terribly dark. The ultramarine part will be the top of the sky. It looks warmer to me. And I'll also let these two colors mix and mingle a bit in the center because I can use some of those as well. It takes a second to get your palette ready, but you always want to make sure you have enough paint mixed up so you don't have to take the time to do that again once you get started. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now, if I look at my sky, I'm going to paint around the major areas of the white clouds, but I'd like to have the bottom part of my sky be very, very pale. So what I'll do in that case is sometimes I will just paint a little bit of clear water on the horizon line. This assures me that my paint will stop there, number one, and it's also a way if I stop right above that water line, the paint will just softly seep in and it won't look hard at the bottom. So I'm just putting a little bit of water down by that horizon line. Okay, so I'm going to start with my bright ultramarine blue and I'm going to paint across as quickly as possible. Make sure your brush is nice and wet. And I'll just add a little water here and there. Because as I move downward toward the horizon line, I don't mind my sky getting a little lighter. When I approach my clouds, I'll just use kind of short little movements because I want to stop the blue where I see where I've drawn my clouds in. So do you see how I'm just using water now to pull the blue sky down and give it kind of a soft look? And then I might pick up some of my cooler blue and add it in. And you see as I approach down here where I put the water down that the blue is even softer because I've got that wet paper to begin with. Now that I've got that in, I can wet my brush again, dry it off, and I can use my damp brush to kind of push the paint around where the clouds are to make it a little bit softer. So remember when we talked about softening edges? That's basically what I'm doing here. I'm using a damp brush to wet the paper where the clouds are because I want to use a tissue. Remember we talked about lifting color with tissues. So I can take a tissue now and I can just kind of press it around where I want my painting to be a little bit lighter. I want that cloud edge to be sharp, but I also want some softness there too because clouds don't just end sharply. They have a little bit of billowiness. I can even touch it up here a little bit if I want to. There, and I'm pretty happy with that. So I'll leave it alone now. We can always go back and make some adjustments to our sky later, but at this point I'm going to leave it alone, I'm going to let it dry, and we'll come back and do the midground. So now that our sky is dry, we're going to mix up some color to paint our midground and our foreground. I've already got some blue on my palette, and I know that the opposite of blue, the complementary color of blue, is orange. So I'm going to use some warm red. And I'm going to take some warm red and add it to this side that I have the cool blue over here. And I want to make just a basic brown. I might need to add more cool blue. And I just keep going back and forth with the two of them until I come to something that I'm happy with. A little bit more. I'm getting more brown now, a little bit more blue, and I should be there. Okay, so I've got a nice kind of warm, darkish brown, and I'm going to use that for that really, really small area of trees that we see in our reference image. I'm going to go ahead and use my larger brush, but I'm just going to use the tippy toe of this pointed round brush. I'll show you the brush mark. It's just sort of like letting the tip of the brush dance across that horizon line, so we get sort of an uneven edge. So I'm going right on the horizon line. I don't mind if I'm going up into the sky. But you see how I'm varying the texture? I'm just letting it kind of dance across. Sometimes it's going to be higher, sometimes it's going to almost be non-existent. And I can follow my reference photo for that, or I can just do it because I know I've got a tree line here. And I'm going to stop about there, wet my brush, kind of dry it off, and then just soften that edge, just like we've done a few times now, softening an edge by using a damp brush. I don't want to wait too long because then that edge will dry and it's harder to soften. I can also soften the top edge just by adding a little bit of a wet brush tip to that tree line. It just sort of gives it a softer edge. Now I'm going to pick up the brown again and I'm going to continue across. A little bit higher in places, lower in others. And if I look at my reference, it ends all the way at the side. Again, wet my brush, dry it off, soften that line, and maybe even soften it a little bit on top. Just a little bit of water on that. And a lot of times when we're looking at tree lines in the distance, we see varying kind of values. We see some in the very distance as being paler, and as they come closer to us, they're a little bit darker. So it's good to have these varying degrees of light and dark in our horizon line. So there is my tree line. I'm going to jump right into the foreground. And if you look at your reference photo, there's this kind of bright yellow right at that tree line. So I'm going to make some of that on my palette, and I'm also going to grab some warm yellow. You can see that as well. So I'm going to take that brightest cool yellow, that lemony yellow, start on this side, and just start pulling it across. Okay, and then it's just sort of this pie shape. I'm going to add some green to this later, but I just want to get that bright yellow in. And there's even a little bit over here. Pick up some of the warm yellow and go right up to that tree line. And now we've just sort of got some brightness in there that we can work with our field tones. If you look at the reference image, there's also some warmer yellow throughout the field. So I can drop that in here and there. We're going to put some green on top of it, but at least I can drop in that color. Remember, we're trying to get large areas of color in first, and I'm following that direction of form line that I see in my reference photo. It doesn't seem like it's going straight across to me. It seems like some of those lines are moving forward, and I'm going to follow that with my paintbrush the way I've drawn it on my reference image. So I'm going to let this foreground dry now, and then we're going to come back in and we're going to mix some greens and put the field grass in. So now that my foreground is dry, I'm going to mix up some different green colors using the same blues and the same yellows that we've used in the sky and in the field so far. So I'll take some of this cool yellow, mix it into an area of my blue, so I'll get kind of a bright grassy green. So I'm using the same colors that I've used in the sky and in the field so far to mix my grass colors, the same blue and the same yellow, so we have that color harmony that we've talked about. Okay, and then I'm going to use some warm yellow to mix up some darker greens. We've also used the warm yellow. So I've got 2 shades of green here, and I may even pull out a little bit more, add some brown to it, and again make my darker green for just in a few places that I want like kind of a really deep olive. So again, I've used the same blues and the same yellows. All of these greens have the same blues and yellows used in them to create that color harmony. Clean my brush off. And I'm going to look at my reference photo for a minute here, and I'm going to notice that the green doesn't cover up the yellow everywhere. So what I can do is I can put a little bit of water where the yellow is that I want to reserve. I really want to keep it in that pie shape. I can bring the green up to it so it kind of softly blends into it without covering it up. So I'm going to start with my reference. It looks like it starts with that really nice bright green, and I'm going to bring that right up to that line that I drew and just sort of drop it in, and that green will flow into that yellow and just kind of lightly mix and mingle with the water, so you'll still see that yellow shining through, which is a really great thing. There's also some lighter green over here, so I'll just sort of drop that in places. Okay, and then I'm going to jump into this darker green. Just touch it a little bit here and there. I'm looking at my reference photo just to get a general idea of where I want darker colors. Every now and then I'll take just a brush with just clean water and go in between to soften. So by using water first and putting wet paint onto wet paper, we're using those wet and wet techniques. When you use a wet and wet technique, you can see that things just sort of mix and mingle and they get really soft. It's sort of dreamy looking, the way the paints react to one another. So I'm going to use a little bit of the really darkest green in my foreground, because as things come closer to us in an image, they get darker. As they move away from us, they're softer. So the back of my field is going to be lighter than the foreground of my field. As with anything, you always want to look at your reference, and sometimes the lighting's different or whatever, and you might have a different situation. But for the most part, these are the rules that apply. So on this side of my foreground, I've got some darker greens. So I've dropped that in. I'm going to soften this one up here because I don't want to totally cover that yellow, but I do want some darker green up there. And you see how I'm kind of using this diagonal motion when I put some of these colors in. Those are the pencil marks I made on the drawing. And it just gives me a little bit of movement in my field. So I might soften a little bit more up here. But generally I'm happy with that, and I'm going to let that be and let it dry, and then we'll come in with some more details later after it dries. I would like to address my sky now. When I look at the sky in my reference photo, these clouds have a very specific shape. So what I can do is I can go underneath the clouds with a little bit more blue paint, and I can paint a hard edge around the clouds and then soften the edge underneath. So I'm just going to take a little bit of my blue that I have here on my palette, move it to the side. And I want this to be fairly light. I don't want it to be a really strong color because the bottom part of my reference photo is definitely a little bit lighter. And I can go in and I can, I don't need to follow it too exactly, but I can sort of dance in some darker blue to give that cloud an edge. And then right away, wet my brush, kind of dry it off, and soften. So that edge kind of disappears. Just soften it right down into that tree line. And I'll even soften it where it meets the other cloud, but I've still kind of created some definition there. Wet brush, just kind of feathering it down. And I can add a little bit more if I need to, just by dropping it in. So in a way, I'm combining my wet on wet and my wet on dry techniques. This painting has both. I'm getting hard edges by putting wet paint on dry paper, and then I'm using water to soften it out. And then I might even take a little bit of that brown and really, that I have on my palette still, and mix it with my blue. See how I'm making just sort of a really soft gray color here? And I can put that just at the bottom. I can touch it just at the bottom of some of these clouds and give it a little bit of a shadow. Because I'm putting it into paint that's already, the paper's already wet here with other paint, it's that wet and wet technique. It's going to be soft and dreamy, not a hard line. But I can still go on top and soften that edge so I don't have a hard edge here. Okay, so we'll let this dry now and we'll come back in and add some final details. So this is getting toward the end of my process, of my plan. I have all of the big shapes in, the main areas of color. Now I'm going to look at some final details. Oftentimes, when I'm at this point in my painting, I'll look at my reference image and I'll kind of say, okay, what can I do to this to bring it a little closer to that? But also you want to look at it as a project, as an image in itself, and say, what do I need to do to make my painting the best it can be at this point? So when I'm looking at this, one thing I notice is that I want to see a little bit of darkness at the horizon line. Typically, when we look at a line of trees, they're going to be lighter on top and darker toward the ground, where they're a little bit in shadow. The sunlight's hitting the top, they're a little bit in shadow at the bottom. And in our reference image, the tree line is so small that it's hard to see that. But if you went out in nature, you'd probably notice it. So I'm just going to go ahead and make some darkness right along the bottom of that tree line, because I feel like the painting needs this. I'm also going to mix up a darker green to put in a few little areas of individual blades of grass, just to give our minds the idea that this is grass that we're looking at. We don't need to paint every blade, but we can paint little suggestions of it here and there to give it the illusion and to let our minds know that we're looking at grass. All right, so let's make up a little bit of a darker brown here again, so I can use what's already on my palette. That's the great thing. And I can just add a little bit more cool blue, because we know from our color charts that cool blue and warm red make a really nice and quick brown. So I'm going to use those two colors. So really the only color I'm not using in this painting is the cool red. Just don't need it. I don't need it. So there's my brown. And I'm going to dry my brush off pretty well, and I'm only going to be using the tip of my brush. So I don't want it to be too wet. I don't want paint to just go everywhere. This is a fairly small area. And I'm going to look at it, I'm going to say, okay, I'm just going to put in a few very, very small areas of darkness, just to give it a little bit of definition. You see how I'm just using the tip of my brush. This is wet on dry, so the paint isn't moving anywhere. Okay, I'm just putting in some little tiny details. I don't want to do too much, but just a few here and there. When we back away from the painting, it'll give us a sense of like solidity where the sky meets the earth. Okay, and just a few more. And it also gives me a chance to sort of clean up that horizon line if I feel like it was a little messy. Okay, again, you don't need to go crazy with it, but just a little bit here and there really helps to kind of bring it down and give you more dimension. So now that that's done, I want to add some grass details. And I'm going to mix up a beautiful dark green. I'm going to use my warm blue. And you'll notice that my palette gets really messy, and that's okay, because all of these colors go together. So you can always just add a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that. It's wonderful fun. And your paintings end up looking more fluid and natural when all of the colors kind of mix and mingle on the palette, and you're getting a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So now I've got a really nice dark green. Again, I'm going to stick with my large brush, but I'm just going to use the tip of it. I'm going to make it a little bit darker. Here's another tip. If you ever have a green and you want to just give it a little bit of edge, a little bit of darkness, I can take a tiny bit of that warm red, just a little, like the tip of my paintbrush, and mix that in. And I can get an even darker green. That I see a little bit too much, so I can just add a little more blue and a little more yellow. It's really just the tip of your brush. Now I've got a nice rich olivey green. Okay, I'm going to dry my brush off, roll it to a point so the paint is just on the tip of my brush. I don't want it too wet. And I'm going to look at my reference image and I'm going to see where I see the darkest areas, where I see those kind of like individual blades of grass that I can notice. So it kind of has to do with the pencil lines I put in the beginning. And I'm just going to do that. I'm going to take the tip of my brush and following the direction of form that I see in the painting, I'm just going to put a few little marks here and there where I see them in the reference photo. It doesn't have to be exact, but as long as you sort of follow the slope of the land and the way you see these marks in the reference photo, you'll be fine. You don't need to put a bunch of them, but just a few here and there really make a difference. Few more. So you notice how I'm making my lines kind of slant. That shows me that the land is slanting. It's moving kind of downward toward me. Again, just a few here and there, just to give me a sense of direction with the land, the way it's moving, and to let my eye know that I'm looking at a field of grass. Really, really fine little marks here and there. So remember when we were practicing with our pointed round brushes and we tried those really, really fine lines that that's kind of what you're doing here. You're using your brush like a pencil. You're drawing with your paintbrush, the very tip of it. If you feel more comfortable using your smaller pointed round, the size 2, that's fine too. But honestly, if you just use the tip of your brush and you've practiced those exercises that we did, this shouldn't be a problem for you. Okay, I might add a little bit of a darker bit here in the front because it does look a little darker to me here. And then I can wet my brush, dry it off, and again just sort of soften what I've done in the very foreground there. And I want it to look like watercolor. I'm not trying to make a photographic copy of this image. I want it to look like watercolor. Okay, so I'm really happy with that. So you can see we've used many of the techniques we've talked about throughout the class. We've used a wash to create the sky, we've lifted out color with tissues, we've softened edges, we've used different kinds of brush strokes to dance around to make the tree line, and almost drew with our paintbrushes to make the grass. We've used color theory, we've talked about color harmony. All of these things come together when we make a painting. So remember, you're a beginner. Try this a few times. It may not always turn out exactly what you have in your mind, you know, it is not always going to come out on the paper. So try it a few times. Share your work with me. I would love to see what you're doing. Maybe I'll have some tips for you. But just try to get it again. That's the most important thing, is that we don't get discouraged when things don't work out right the first time. Up next, we're going to try a seascape.